Hey everyone, I'm posting this to get some advice and share my experience. A group of friends and I recently went camping in a dense, uncharted forest near our town. It's a place locals always talked about with a mix of fear and fascination. The stories were always the same, people going in and never coming out. We figured it would be an adventurous trip. Little did we know what awaited us. We arrived early in the morning, the air crisp and filled with the scent of pine. The forest was eerily silent, save for the crunch of our boots on the forest floor. We set up camp near a small clearing, surrounded by towering trees whose branches seemed to reach out like skeletal fingers. As the sun began to set, the forest transformed. Shadows grew long and twisted, and an unsettling chill crept into the air. We made a campfire and joked about the legends, trying to shake off the creeping sense of dread that was starting to settle in. By the time nightfall came, the forest was cloaked in darkness, the kind that felt almost tangible. We huddled around the fire, trying to ignore the noises that seemed to echo from the trees. It was then that things began to go wrong. One of us, Jake, heard something rustling in the bushes just beyond the firelight. He went to investigate, joking about finding a raccoon or something equally mundane. But when he didn't return after several minutes, we started to worry. We called out for him, but there was no response. A sense of unease gripped us as we realized the forest was unnaturally silent now. No crickets, no owls, just an oppressive quiet. We decided to search for Jake, but the forest seemed to shift and change as we ventured deeper. Trees that had been in plain view moments ago were now obscured by thick fog that had rolled in unexpectedly. The air grew colder, and with every step, the feeling of being watched intensified. Suddenly, a scream pierced the silence. We ran toward the sound, only to find Jake's flashlight lying on the ground, its beam flickering erratically. There was no sign of him, just the oppressive darkness and the growing realization that something was terribly wrong. We returned to the camp, our minds racing. The forest seemed to be closing in on us, the trees almost appearing to move when we weren't looking. We tried to keep our nerves steady, but each snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made us jump. As we huddled together, trying to devise a plan, we heard a low, guttural growl emanating from the forest. It was unlike anything we had ever heard, and it seemed to come from all directions at once. Panic set in, and we knew we had to get out before whatever was lurking out there found us. But the forest seemed determined to keep us trapped. We grabbed our gear and started moving, but the path we had taken earlier was now unrecognizable. It felt as though the forest was deliberately confusing us, leading us deeper into its dark heart. Every direction we tried seemed to lead us back to where we started. It was then that we saw it. An old, dilapidated sign barely visible through the fog. It read, "Turn back now." But it was too late. The forest had already swallowed us whole. I don't know how much longer we have before something finds us. The growling is getting closer, and the shadows around us are moving in ways that defy logic. We're lost, scared, and our chances of escaping this nightmare are slipping away. I just hope someone finds this before it's too late. If you're reading this, stay away from the forest. Don't make the same mistake we did. We kept moving, trying to stay calm and rational, but the forest seemed to conspire against us. The oppressive fog made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead, and the eerie silence was broken only by the occasional snap of a twig or rustle of leaves that felt all too deliberate. As we pushed through the undergrowth, we stumbled upon what appeared to be an old, abandoned campsite. The remnants of a fire pit and broken camping gear were scattered around. But what caught our attention were the strange symbols carved into the nearby trees, symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. We didn't spend much time examining them. We were too focused on finding a way out, but the symbols unsettled us. It was as if they were warning us, or maybe beckoning us, deeper into the forest. After what felt like hours of aimless wandering, we started to notice something disturbing. Every now and then, we'd catch glimpses of movement in the corner of our eyes. Shadows that seemed to flit between the trees, shapes that seemed to shift and dissolve as soon as we turned to look. Our radios, which had been working fine before, were now completely dead. We tried calling out to Jake again, but there was no answer. Our voices felt swallowed by the oppressive darkness, leaving us with only the sound of our own panicked breaths. Then came the first truly horrifying discovery. As we pushed through a particularly dense thicket, we came across a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was a crudely fashioned wooden effigy, standing about 6 feet tall. It was made of twisted branches and adorned with what looked like animal bones. Its face was obscured by a dark hollow hood, and its arms seemed to reach out as if pleading for help, or threatening us to stay away. We tried to ignore it and continued walking, but the atmosphere grew heavier. The fog thickened, and the forest seemed to close in around us. It felt as if the trees were alive, their branches stretching out like gnarled hands, reaching for us in the darkness. A low, rhythmic thumping began to emanate from the forest. It was as if a large, unseen heartbeat was pulsing through the ground, resonating in our bones. With every beat, the shadows seemed to grow darker, and the trees seemed to lean in closer. We stumbled upon another unsettling sight, a series of small makeshift graves, marked with crudely carved headstones. Each grave had a small object placed on top, personal items like photographs, trinkets, and even a child's toy. It was as if someone had been burying their dead here, and the items were left as a macabre tribute. The air grew colder, and a sense of dread washed over us. We were no longer just lost. We were being watched, tracked by something unseen. The growling we had heard earlier was now accompanied by whispering voices that seemed to come from all directions, too faint to understand but filled with malicious intent. We tried to stay together, but the forest was determined to tear us apart. We felt like we were walking in circles, retracing our steps without realizing it. Every direction seemed to lead us back to the same unsettling sights: the effigy, the graves, the strange symbols on the trees. Our only solace was the brief moments of light when we used our flashlights, but even those seemed to flicker and die at the worst possible times. We were running on adrenaline and fear, but it was clear that something was hunting us, something that knew the forest far better than we ever could. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own, and as the thumping grew louder, it felt as though the entire forest was closing in on us, ready to devour us whole. We need to find a way out, fast. The darkness is closing in and we're running out of time. We kept moving, but the forest was relentless. The more we tried to escape, the more disoriented we became. It was as if the forest had its own sense of time and space, twisting reality to confuse and torment us. We stumbled upon an old, decrepit cabin. It looked abandoned, but we were desperate for shelter and a place to regroup. The door creaked open with a groan that echoed too loudly in the oppressive silence. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty, with furniture covered in layers of dust. The walls were lined with strange drawings, similar to the symbols we had seen earlier, interspersed with cryptic messages written in what looked like blood. We lit a few candles from our supplies and tried to make sense of our situation. The cabin seemed to offer a brief respite, but it felt wrong, as if the very air inside was tainted with malevolence. The candles flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls and seemed to take on a life of their own. It was then that we heard something that made our blood run cold, the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from outside the cabin. We huddled together, hearts pounding as the footsteps grew louder and closer. We could see shadows moving outside the cracked windows, their shapes twisting and shifting in the candlelight. Jake's name was still on our lips, and we called out for him one more time, but our voices were swallowed by the forest's oppressive darkness. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and an unsettling silence followed. We waited, barely breathing, as the minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Suddenly, the door to the cabin burst open with a force that sent us sprawling. Standing in the doorway was a figure, cloaked in darkness, its face obscured. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its movements were jerky and unnatural. The figure didn't say a word, but its presence alone was enough to freeze us in place. We tried to get up and run, but our legs felt like lead. The figure moved closer, and with every step it took, the temperature dropped further. The shadows in the cabin seemed to close in, wrapping around us like a suffocating blanket. In a desperate attempt to defend ourselves, we grabbed whatever we could find: rusty tools, old kitchen knives, anything that might offer some protection. But the figure seemed unaffected, its eyes, if it had any, hidden beneath the shroud of darkness. The figure let out a low, guttural sound that echoed through the cabin, vibrating through our bones. It was as if the very air was charged with a dark energy. We tried to strike out at it, but our weapons passed through the figure as if it were made of smoke. The lights flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. The figure was gone, but the cabin now felt even more oppressive. The walls seemed to close in on us, and the floor beneath us felt unstable, as though it might give way at any moment. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic. They seemed to be coming from inside our heads, mingling with our own thoughts, feeding our fear and confusion. The shadows on the walls began to move, contorting into grotesque shapes that seemed to mock our plight. We had no choice but to leave the cabin. We stumbled out into the darkness, the fog even thicker than before. The forest seemed to pulse with a malevolent rhythm, guiding us deeper into its depths. We found ourselves in another clearing, this one larger and even more unsettling than the first. In the center was a large stone altar covered in strange symbols and covered in what looked like old, dried blood. Surrounding the altar were piles of bones, human and animal, arranged in disturbing patterns. The forest around us seemed to come alive with an eerie, rhythmic chanting that grew louder with every passing moment. The trees seemed to sway in time with the chant, their branches reaching out as if to grasp us. The forest was no longer just a place of darkness and fear. It had become an active, malevolent force, one that was determined to keep us trapped and tormented. Our sense of time and reality was fracturing, and it felt as though we were slipping further into a nightmarish world that defied all logic. We have to keep moving, but the forest is closing in. The altar's dark energy seems to be drawing us in, and we can't afford to lose hope. If we don't find a way out soon, we may become permanent residents of this twisted living nightmare. We left the clearing with the stone altar behind, but the forest seemed to grow more oppressive with every step. The whispers had become almost unbearable, weaving through our thoughts and making it impossible to concentrate. The fog continued to thicken, and the trees closed in around us, their gnarled branches reaching out as if to ensnare us. Our once clear path was now obscured, and every direction we took seemed to lead us deeper into the forest's heart. After what felt like hours of stumbling through the darkness, we came across a narrow, overgrown trail. It was barely visible, but we hoped it might lead us to safety. As we moved along the trail, we noticed strange, almost imperceptible signs: broken branches arranged in patterns, small piles of stones, and crude markings on the trees. It was as if someone, or something, had been guiding us. We pressed on, and the trail eventually led us to an old, crumbling building that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The walls were covered in ivy, and the roof was partially caved in. It was the only shelter we had seen in a while, so we decided to investigate. Inside, the building was a mix of decaying furniture and old relics. The air was thick with dust and mold. As we explored, we found old photographs and newspaper clippings scattered around. They depicted people who looked like they were from another era, each one with a blank, hollow stare. One photograph stood out. It was a group of people standing in front of a large, ominous tree. The tree was unmistakably the same as the one we had seen near the altar. The people in the photograph were all wearing expressions of terror, their eyes wide and filled with dread. We found a journal tucked away in a dusty drawer. Its pages were filled with frantic, almost illegible writing. The entries spoke of a forest that was alive, of people who had vanished without a trace, and of rituals performed to appease the malevolent spirits that dwelled within. One entry was particularly chilling. "The forest is hungry. It feeds on fear and sorrow. Those who enter are lost to its darkness. There is no escape." As we read through the journal, the whispers grew louder, as if the forest was reacting to our discovery. The temperature in the building dropped sharply, and we could see our breaths condensing in the cold air. Then came the sound that made our blood run cold, a rhythmic tapping noise coming from somewhere within the building. It was slow and deliberate, like the sound of something scratching or knocking from within the walls. We followed the sound, our hearts racing, until we reached a small room in the back of the building. The tapping was louder here, almost frantic. As we pushed open the door, we were greeted by a sight that made us recoil in horror. In the center of the room was a makeshift cell, and inside it was a man, or what was left of one. His eyes were wide with a mix of terror and madness, and his clothes were tattered. He was muttering incoherently, repeating phrases like, "They're coming," and "I couldn't escape." As we approached him, he looked up with a mixture of hope and desperation. "Please," he begged, "you have to get out of here. They're coming for you next. The forest, it doesn't let anyone leave. It takes them." Before we could respond, the room was filled with an overwhelming darkness, as if the shadows themselves had come alive. The man's cries turned to screams, and the darkness closed in around us. We could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on us, as if it were trying to drag us into its depths. We stumbled back into the main room, our minds reeling from the encounter. The whispers had turned into a cacophony of voices, each one more insistent and malevolent than the last. The building seemed to be closing in on us, the walls bending and shifting in impossible ways. We had no choice but to leave the building. The trail we had followed was now completely obscured, and we felt utterly disoriented. The forest had become an incomprehensible maze, and every step we took seemed to lead us deeper into its clutches. We're exhausted, terrified, and running out of options. The forest is alive with malevolent energy, and we can feel its presence closing in on us. We need to find a way out, if such a thing even exists, before it's too late. The forest has turned into a living nightmare. The deeper we go, the more disoriented we become. It's like trying to navigate through a maze where the walls constantly shift, and every path seems to lead to another dead end. We kept moving, trying to stay together, but the forest seemed to have a mind of its own. The fog was thicker than ever, swirling around us and making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The oppressive darkness made everything feel claustrophobic, and the trees seemed to close in on us from all sides. The whispers grew louder, merging into an incoherent chorus of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. They spoke of despair and torment, filling our minds with a sense of dread that was almost palpable. At one point, we stumbled upon a small, dilapidated structure that looked like an old watchtower. It was barely standing, its wooden beams rotting and covered in creeping vines. We decided to climb up, hoping it would give us a better vantage point to figure out our location. The climb was treacherous, but we managed to reach the top. The view was both a blessing and a curse. The forest stretched out endlessly in all directions, a sea of shadowy trees and fog. There was no sign of civilization, no hint of escape. The whispers grew louder as if the forest was trying to drown us in its malevolent presence. As we descended from the tower, we noticed something disturbing. The ground around the tower was littered with personal items, photos, jewelry, and clothing, all arranged in strange, ritualistic patterns. It was as if someone had been marking their path through the forest, leaving behind these grim tokens. We continued our trek, but the forest seemed to be toying with us. Every direction we took led us back to the same landmarks, the broken tower, the strange symbols on the trees. It was as if the forest was deliberately keeping us trapped in its labyrinthine grasp. Then we heard it again, the rhythmic thumping, growing louder and more insistent. It was accompanied by a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from deep within the earth. The sound reverberated through the forest, making it feel as if the very ground beneath us was alive and restless. In our desperation, we followed the sound, hoping it might lead us to some form of salvation. The forest grew darker, the fog thicker, and the whispers turned into a cacophony of anguish and rage. It felt like the forest was closing in on us, its darkness almost suffocating. We came to another clearing, this one unlike the others. In the center was a large ancient tree with gnarled roots that seemed to twist and writhe as if alive. The tree's bark was covered in strange glowing symbols, and its branches stretched out like skeletal arms. At the base of the tree was a large stone slab, engraved with more of the disturbing symbols we had seen earlier. On the slab were several items, a bloodied knife, a torn journal, and a collection of small, hand-carved figures. The air around the slab felt charged with a dark energy, making our skin crawl. We were too exhausted and frightened to fully process what we were seeing. The whispers had turned into a constant, overwhelming presence in our minds, making it impossible to think clearly. The rhythmic thumping grew louder, almost deafening, and the mournful wail became a continuous, piercing sound. Suddenly, the clearing was filled with a blinding light. We shielded our eyes, and when we could finally see again, the tree and the stone slab were gone. In their place was a dense, impenetrable fog that seemed to stretch out infinitely in all directions. We were back where we started, but everything felt different, more sinister, more oppressive. The forest was no longer just a place of darkness and fear. It had become an entity, a living, breathing thing that was determined to keep us trapped within its depths. Our only option was to keep moving, to push forward despite the overwhelming sense of hopelessness. We don't know what awaits us, but we have to find a way out, before the forest claims us completely. The forest has become an even more twisted nightmare. The fog seems to have a life of its own, thick and suffocating, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. It feels like we're moving through an endless void, where time has no meaning and the normal rules of reality no longer apply. Our desperate attempts to find a way out have only led us deeper into confusion. The landmarks we had seen earlier, like the watchtower and the ancient tree, are now gone, as if they were figments of our imagination. The forest seems to be in a constant state of flux, shifting and changing with every step we take. We came across something that made our hearts drop, a series of crude, makeshift markers. They were hastily made with broken branches and scraps of clothing, forming a trail that seemed to lead deeper into the forest. The markers were eerily familiar, almost identical to the ones we had seen near the watchtower. As we followed the trail, we started to hear faint voices. At first, we thought they were our own minds playing tricks on us, but the voices grew clearer, more distinct. They were calling out for help, pleading desperate cries that sent shivers down our spines. The voices led us to a small clearing where we found a campfire that had been recently used. The embers were still warm, and there were remnants of food, cans, wrappers, and a few scattered personal items. The most disturbing find was a small, blood-stained journal lying in the dirt. The pages were filled with frantic scribbles and drawings of the forest, interspersed with messages like, "They're watching us," and "We're lost forever." As we examined the journal, the voices grew louder and more frantic. It was clear that we weren't alone in this nightmare. We turned to see shadows moving in the fog, shapes that seemed to flicker and vanish whenever we tried to get a closer look. The whispers became more insistent, merging into a haunting chant that echoed through the trees. The sound was hypnotic, almost compelling, and it made it difficult to think clearly. The forest felt alive, its malevolent presence pressing down on us from all sides. We tried to follow the voices, hoping they would lead us to someone who could help us. But as we moved deeper into the forest, the voices grew fainter, replaced by a sense of overwhelming dread. The fog seemed to close in tighter, making it almost impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. We came across more markers, each one more elaborate and disturbing than the last. There were piles of bones arranged in grotesque patterns, strange symbols painted in what looked like dried blood, and even a few old tattered clothing items hanging from the trees. It was as if the forest had become a macabre gallery of its own, displaying the remnants of those who had come before us. As we continued, we saw something that made our blood run cold. Figures moving in the distance, their forms barely visible through the fog. They seemed to be moving in a slow, deliberate manner, their movements almost mechanical. We tried to call out to them, but our voices were swallowed by the oppressive silence. We realized that these figures were not like us. They were different. They moved with an unnatural grace, their bodies contorted in ways that defied normal anatomy. Their faces were hidden by shadows, but their presence was unmistakably ominous. One of the figures turned and seemed to look directly at us, its eyes glowing with a faint, eerie light. The sight sent a wave of terror through us, and we turned to run, but the forest seemed to close in around us, blocking our way. We had to keep moving, but every direction we took seemed to lead us back to the same unsettling markers and haunting figures. The forest was playing a cruel game with us, and the sense of being watched was overwhelming. It was as if the forest had a will of its own, determined to keep us trapped within its dark embrace. Our hope of escape is dwindling, and the forest's malevolent presence feels more real than ever. We need to find a way out before it's too late, but the forest seems to be tightening its grip, ensuring that no one leaves its twisted confines. We've lost all sense of direction. The forest has become a maddening labyrinth of shifting shadows and endless fog. It's as if the very trees and fog are conspiring against us, twisting and turning to keep us trapped in their suffocating grasp. The oppressive atmosphere has started to affect our minds. We're plagued by hallucinations and an ever-present feeling of dread. The whispers have become almost deafening, a constant, malevolent presence in our ears that seems to feed on our fear. We stumbled upon another clearing, this one different from the others. It was eerily quiet, the usual forest sounds absent. At the center of the clearing was a massive tree, its trunk hollowed out to create a large, gaping cavity. The tree's bark was covered in deep, dark grooves, and the inside of the hollow was filled with strange, ritualistic items: bones, feathers, and old, worn-out trinkets. As we approached the hollow, a cold wind blew through the clearing, carrying with it a scent of decay and rot. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive. We noticed something else in the hollow, an old, tattered banner with symbols that matched those we had seen earlier. It seemed to be part of some ancient dark ritual. The shadows around the hollow began to shift and change, taking on grotesque forms that seemed to writhe and twist in the dim light. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the forest itself was trying to warn us or drive us mad. Suddenly, one of the figures we had seen before appeared at the edge of the clearing. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, and its face was hidden by a dark hooded cloak. It didn't move toward us, but instead stood at a distance, watching us with an almost palpable sense of malevolence. We tried to ignore the figure and focus on the hollow. Inside, we found something that made our blood run cold. A collection of small, hand-carved figurines arranged in a disturbing tableau. Each figurine represented a different person, their faces twisted into expressions of terror. It was as if the figurines were depicting the final moments of those who had been trapped in the forest before us. The figure at the edge of the clearing seemed to be watching us intently. Its presence was unsettling, and we could feel its gaze burning into us. We decided to leave the clearing, hoping to put some distance between ourselves and the eerie scene. But as we turned to leave, we noticed that the fog had grown thicker, closing in around us like a living entity. The path we had taken to reach the clearing was now obscured, and every direction seemed to lead us back to the same spot. The forest was actively preventing us from leaving, its malevolent will ensuring we remained trapped in its grasp. The whispers grew louder, their frantic tones merging into a deafening roar. It felt as if the forest was trying to consume us, to swallow us whole. Our sense of reality was fracturing, and the line between hallucination and reality was becoming increasingly blurred. We began to see figures moving in the fog, people who looked like they were lost, just like us. Their faces were distorted and their movements erratic, as if they were trapped in a perpetual state of fear and confusion. It was impossible to tell if they were real or just another trick of the forest. We're exhausted and terrified, and the forest's dark presence feels more oppressive than ever. It's clear that whatever force controls this place is growing more aggressive, determined to keep us trapped in its nightmarish maze. We have to find a way out, but every step we take only seems to lead us further into the forest's twisted depths. We're running out of time and hope. The forest is closing in, and its malevolent grip is tightening. If we don't find a way out soon, we may become permanent residents of this forsaken place, lost forever in its dark embrace. The forest's grip has tightened to the point where it feels almost suffocating. Every direction we take seems to lead us deeper into the fog, and the whispers have become a relentless, overwhelming force in our minds. The feeling of being watched is constant, and the eerie sense of dread has reached a breaking point. Our group is on edge, with exhaustion and fear taking their toll. We've lost track of time and can no longer distinguish between day and night. The forest has become a never-ending nightmarish labyrinth, and our hope of escape is dwindling. We stumbled into another clearing, and this one was unlike anything we had seen before. It was a vast, circular space with an otherworldly, almost surreal atmosphere. The clearing was illuminated by an eerie, pale light that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. In the center of the clearing was a large, stone altar, similar to the one we had seen earlier, but more elaborate. The altar was covered in strange, glowing symbols that pulsed with a rhythmic, almost hypnotic light. Surrounding the altar were dozens of eerie, distorted figures, twisted, nightmarish shapes that seemed to float and writhe in the light. As we approached the altar, we noticed something chilling. The symbols on the altar were not just random markings. They formed a complex pattern that seemed to depict the entire layout of the forest. It was as if the forest itself was a living entity, and the altar was its heart. The whispers grew louder, merging into a single maddening voice that spoke of ancient rituals and dark bargains. It was clear that the forest had a malevolent purpose, that it fed on the fear and despair of those who became lost within its depths. We were drawn to the altar, unable to resist its dark allure. The figures surrounding it seemed to beckon us closer, their grotesque forms shifting and changing with each passing moment. The air was filled with a palpable sense of malevolence, and the rhythmic light of the symbols seemed to pulse in time with our racing hearts. As we reached the altar, we noticed a series of intricate carvings on its surface. The carvings depicted scenes of people, some of whom looked like us, being consumed by shadows and darkness. It was as if the altar was a gateway, a portal through which the forest could draw in those who ventured too close. We were on the brink of losing ourselves completely when a sudden blinding flash of light illuminated the clearing. The light was so intense that it made us shield our eyes, and when it faded, we were confronted with a sight that made our blood run cold. The clearing had transformed. The altar was gone and the figures had vanished. Instead, we were surrounded by a dense, impenetrable fog that seemed to stretch out infinitely. The forest had reverted to its oppressive, twisting labyrinth, and the path we had taken was now completely obscured. The whispers had turned into a deafening roar, a cacophony of voices that seemed to merge into one. It was clear that the forest was closing in on us, determined to keep us trapped forever. In our final desperate attempt to escape, we ran in the direction that seemed the most promising, hoping against hope that it would lead us to safety. The fog swirled around us and the whispers grew louder, almost as if the forest was mocking our futile efforts. We've reached a point where hope seems almost non-existent. The forest has become an all-consuming entity, and its dark presence is more overwhelming than ever. It's as if the very air we breathe is tainted with its malevolence, and every step we take only seems to lead us deeper into its grasp. If there's any chance of escape, it seems to be slipping away with each passing moment. The forest is relentless, and its dark will is almost palpable. Our only hope is to keep moving, to push forward despite the overwhelming fear and despair. If we don't find a way out soon, we may become permanent residents of this twisted, nightmarish realm, a place where the dark will forever claim those who dare to enter.